Say my name.
Heisenberg.
You're goddamn right.
Breaking Bad is a show that I consider perfect television, and for a show about drugs, each episode really keeps you hooked, and before you know it, it's 5:57 in the morning and you have to be to work in 2 hours, but you have to know what happens to Walter after the ending of Crawl Space. True story. And with a show that ended nearly a decade ago, the fan base is just as strong as Harry Potter or the MCU. Maybe because its prequel was just as great, but Breaking Bad is a show that tells the story about the rise and fall of Walter White, a high school chemistry teacher who graduated to drug kingpin, pun intended, leaving behind a legacy of lies, drugs, and murder all the way up until his death, and forever changing the lives of everyone he's ever come in contact with, from his own family to even the son of his partner's girlfriend. No one is safe from Heisenberg. And when the show wraps up, it's tight, like tight as can be, like
Tight, yeah!
with one of the best endings to any piece of media in recent years. But with me being a YouTube boy with a wild imagination, I noticed there are a few characters who we don't exactly get closure for, and we're left to speculate on what their lives become. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this video. So I've compiled a list of characters in this show whose fates were left somewhat ambiguous, and I'm here to fill in the blanks on what may have potentially happened. And I'm willing to bet $5 by at the end of this video, you'll be thinking,
it is acceptable.
But before we get started, if you can leave a like on this video to support the channel and even consider subscribing to stay up to date with the latest content, I'd appreciate it. Now, the first person I want to mention is Ted Beneke. You know, Skylar's tax evading side piece and her old boss. I mean, sure, the last time we saw Ted, he broke his neck by tripping on the rug, and now he's looking like this, and I'm pretty sure he's disabled. And I mean, he did tell Skylar that he wouldn't tell anyone what happened to him, and honestly, I believed him. At the time. But Ted strikes me as the kind of person that would take an opportunity without question. Case in point, when he just blindly took money from Saul regarding his great aunt Bridget, and I'm using air quotes here, and instead of doing what he needed to do, like pay the IRS or some of his debts, the first thing he does, like the very first thing he does, is buy a Mercedes. So on one hand, Ted could have taken what happened to him as a sign for God and punishment for all the wrong he's done, and he'll live out the rest of his life trying to atone for his sins. But on the other hand, what I think could have happened is once news of Walter White's Heisenberg life was revealed, an ongoing trial is happening for Skylar for her involvement in being a possible accomplice after Walter's death. And maybe Ted will offer himself to be a key witness to get sympathy from the court and maybe even frame Skylar as the real brains behind the operation, saying that she hired thugs to come to his house, causing him to fear for his life, and he was left for dead. And with his testimony, he'd probably get the well-respected doctor to give him his treatment for free, maybe even the same one who had Gus treat Hector, and she'd be willing to do it knowing her connection to Gus and Gus's connection to Walter, and in turn Skylar. So I mean, it's not unreasonable to think of, because Ted and Skylar do have this flip-flop relationship where Ted might have this underlying hatred for Skylar and would be willing to do anything to get even with her any way he can. So any thoughts of an hour-long court drama with Ted versus Skylar? I mean, it could happen. If not, I got a few more on my list. Next, we have the kid from the Peekaboo episode, and I was trying to come up with something more than, after the police answered the call that Jesse made, the kid was taken to Child Protective Services, but then I thought about it. Maybe the kid was put in foster care, and after a year or two, he ended up getting adopted by Gretchen and Elliot, who are unable to have kids on their own. And after meeting with Skylar and Walter Jr. for the whole irrevocable trust promise, and after seeing Holly growing, Gretchen expressed her feelings for always wanting to have kids, and without thinking, Elliot goes to a nearby foster home. And as they're touring the place and seeing the children in the home, one kid stands out to Gretchen, a little red-headed boy who's just sitting by himself watching TV. And when Gretchen walks up to him, he looks at her for a moment and smiles, then looks back at the TV. And in that moment, she could not explain it, but she had a connection with this boy, and he is the one that she wants. And after a few weeks, they adopt him, and then they name the boy Walter, being both a cliche and poetic, as Walter White's product was the reason for the kid's parents being meth heads. And for Gretchen, you can say that Walter made her realize what she always wanted: a family. Now, I know this one is a huge stretch, but I mean, in the Breaking Bad Better Call Saul-averse, anything can happen. Moving on, and speaking of the White family, or what's left of it, I can imagine after they get the money from Gretchen and Elliot, they all get their names changed back to Skylar's maiden name, Lambert. And maybe after getting a deal worked out with the feds, they move somewhere quiet. They move somewhere far away. Just to think of a random place, Alaska. Oh, geez, that's where Jesse is. I mean, Mr. Driscoll. I guess we'll make this work. So maybe one day in a cafe, the Lamberts are all having brunch. There's laughter and conversation being had about the future. Then Skylar glances around the cafe to see Mr. Driscoll, and they exchange a look for a moment, acknowledging each other. Then Walter Jr. gets her attention, looking away for a moment, and when she looks back, Mr. Driscoll is gone, and Skylar wonders if it was really Jesse Pinkman that she saw, or was it just all in her head? And she doesn't linger long on that thought too long as she feeds Holly another bit of pastry. And scene. So this right here feels like one of those one-off where are they now type episodes, giving us a happy ending to our tortured characters who survived Walter White. And yes, the ending is from The Dark Knight Rises, but I mean, And sticking with the tone of Dark Knight, let's talk about young Brock Cantillo or Cantillo. Now with this one I want to paint a picture. So imagine you're 6 years old and you and your mom are watching a movie. Then suddenly you hear a knock at the door, but you being 6, you don't care. So your mom gets the door and she steps out for a few minutes. Some more time passes by and you realize, man, mom's been gone for a while. So you decide to go see what's going on. And when you open the door, you see that your mom is dead on the front porch with a bullet in the back of her head. Do you think that would be something that would stay with you forever? Then you couple that with being poisoned and then your cousin being killed all within the span of 2 years? This kid has all the circumstances for turning out like a Batman, but he'd probably be more like a Red Hood if we're being honest in the Breaking Bad universe. But with Brock, he'd be different because he'd never turned to drugs, but instead he turned to guns, even owning one at 14. But he'd keep his hobbies and interests to himself, not wanting to worry his grandmother. But on his 18th birthday, she'd give him a letter that was addressed to him in a green envelope, the same one that we seen written by Jesse in El Camino. And she kept it from him all these years because she felt he deserved to know, but only when he was older. As he begins reading the letter, his mind flashes back to when he first met Jesse. Then it flashes to seeing his mom dead on the porch that night. And then he starts to grab the paper tighter as tears stream down his face and then onto the paper, because all his life he wondered why for so many things, and there was never an answer that made sense. Why did his mom have to die? Why did Tomas have to die? Why did Jesse have to leave? Why do I feel the way I feel? And with reading the letter, it provided closure to Brock in every way, leaving him numb and just wanting to be left alone. And later that night, we'd see Brock at his mom's gravesite and he would just read the letter aloud and the camera would zoom out as he's reading and then fade to black. And that would be Brock, a man who could have been the worst of the worst given his circumstances. He could have very much turned out like a Tuco, but his fate was changed overnight because of a letter. And with this one, it could be like a standalone TV movie with only flashbacks to Breaking Bad characters, and honestly, there's not really that many in Brock's circle other than maybe Walter White poisoning him. That would be cool. And then Tomas and Andrea, and then we can get maybe a voiceover of Jesse reading the letter. But that's just me and my thoughts on what I would say are fill-in-the-blank stories of characters who we don't exactly see get an ending to their stories. But let me know down below if you agree with these Breaking Bad what if stories, or even if you want me to do a story on a different character. I'm open to suggestions and I'll do my best to respond. Until then, my name is Gerald, but you can call me Merge. Later.